Good morning. Good morning, Easton.
Good morning.
Have you been able to figure out the Nearpod issue or no?
Oh, I have no idea. You're the only class that I uses Nearpod, so I haven't really.
Are you still on your iPad or are you using a laptop?
Oh well, I have my laptop next to me if I need it, but
Okay, let's
I
try doing the Nearpod on your laptop and maybe that'll help.
okay.
Because I think it
It's
maybe.
dead actually. Hold on, let me grab my charger.
Okay.
Switch.
Good morning, Ray. How are you? Good. Good morning, Peyton. Good morning, Giselle. Good morning, Torin. Good morning, Ashley. I'm going to go ahead and give you guys the link to the Nearpod so you can go ahead and log in, and it should start you on the journal entry so you guys can begin to fill that out. Good morning, Haley. Good morning, Alejandro. And Amaris. Zion. Good morning, Zion. I'm going to go ahead again and post the Nearpod link for all of you so that you can go ahead and get started on your journal entries. And then we will wait just a couple more minutes to see if we get anybody else. Good morning, Navi. Here is the Nearpod link for you. For those of you who are here, if you could turn your camera on, if you are able to, I would appreciate it. As always, if it interferes with you hearing me, you can turn it back off, but hopefully it won't. That's one of the things that Nearpod is supposed to be good for, is that it makes it easier on the bandwidth for your computer. Okay. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. We were talking about the 3 genres, right? Or 4 genres, really, because we don't have any playwrights from that period. Remember, they're mostly anonymous. So I have 10 people in the Nearpod. So here again is the Nearpod link. Begin to do your journal entry. If you don't have time to finish it, you can complete it later. And there is a copy of this PowerPoint in Schoology as always. We're just missing a couple of the people who are normally here. Brantavian's not here. Cash, Bennett. Bennett's almost always here, so we'll give him just 2 more minutes and then we've got to get moving. One more minute and we're going to have to go ahead and get started. Okay, Ashley, that's okay. If you're having problems with your computer, you can always do edtech at Uplift. If you need the code for the Nearpod, it is NWBAS, and I will post that in the chat. See, 14 people are logged on. I'm missing 2 people. Let's see. I see Easton. Got Ray. Got Torin. Got Mario. Got Giselle. Got Yulissa. Got Navi. And Peyton. I don't see. Oh, now I've got 15. All right. Well, that's what it is. So NWBAS if it asks for a code. I put it in the chat. Oh, sorry, Mario. That wasn't for you. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So that was your journal, right? So if you didn't get a chance to finish that, you will do it later as part of your homework. So today we're going to talk about Elizabethan theater, and we're going to start with a little video. So go ahead and hit play on this. It's just a couple of minutes long, and then we will talk about it. Where is it? Why is it not letting me play it though? It's letting you guys play it? I might have added it wrong. It's not letting you play it in the Nearpod. Here's the YouTube link. So go ahead and play that, and then we will talk about it.
Catherine of Aragon was one. She failed to give me a son. I had to ask her for a divorce. That broke up her heart, of course. Young Anne Boleyn, she was two. Had a daughter, the best she could do. I said she flirted with some other man and offered.
I just posted the link in YouTube. You can't watch it. Here, let me just share it then. I was hoping to avoid that because I know it slows it down, but that's okay. All right, let me make sure I have sound on. Here we go.
Terrible Tudors.
Divorced, beheaded, and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. I'm Henry VIII, I had 6 sorry wives. Some might say I ruined their lives. Catherine of Aragon was one. She failed to give me a son. I had to ask her for a divorce. That broke up her heart, of course. Young Anne Boleyn, she was two. Had a daughter, the best she could do. I said she flirted with some other man, and off with the chop went dear Anne. Lovely Jane Seymour was 3, the love of a lifetime for me. She gave me a son, little Prince Ed. Then poor old Jane went and dropped dead. Divorced, beheaded, and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. I'm Henry VIII, I had 6 sorry wives. Some might say I ruined their lives. Anne of Cleves came at 4. I fell for the portrait I saw. Then laid eyes on her face and cried, she's a horse! I must have another divorce. Catherine Howard was 5, a child of 19, so alive. She flirted with others, no way to behave. The axe sent young Cath to her grave. Catherine Parr, she was lost. By then all my best days were past. I lay on my deathbed, aged just 55. Lucky Catherine, the last, stayed alive. I mean, how unfair. Ugh. Divorced, beheaded, and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. I'm Henry VIII, I had 6 sorry wives. You could say I ruined their lives.
Exciting news! Henry VIII is looking for a new wife.
Oh no.
What did I say?
Horrible history.
Okay, so the reason why, let's go ahead and go back to the Nearpod, is that this is important because it establishes some of the stuff that's happening in England at this time. So when we were talking about medieval theater, right, what were they using the theater to teach at first? Yes, okay, religion, the church, okay, right. And what church were they teaching? Like what church was responsible for most of this? Anybody remember? Yeah, the Catholic Church, right? Okay. So what happens with Henry VIII, right? And if you know anything about the Catholic Church, is that they didn't grant divorces, right? That wasn't a thing that they did. So Henry VIII is married to his first wife, Catherine. He wants a son, he wants an heir. It's not happening. So he asks the Pope for a divorce, and the Pope is like, absolutely not, right? So Henry VIII decides then to break with the Catholic Church and to make his own religion, basically, make his own church called the Anglican Church that he was the head of so that he could basically grant himself a divorce, right? So that's as we're going through all of his wives, right? He divorces his first wife. His second wife, she's only giving him girls, not sons. So he finds a way to basically have her killed. His third wife dies. His fourth wife, she's sort of flirty and flighty, so he has her killed. Or no, I'm sorry, they get a divorce. His fifth wife, he has her killed, and then his sixth wife, he dies before he can do anything about her, basically. But yeah, so he forms this whole new church, which is still the Church of England to this day, because he wants to get a divorce, essentially. Okay. And this is going to be important because when Elizabeth I, who is one of his daughters with his second wife, Anne Boleyn, comes to power, there's a lot of tension between these religions, right? Just imagine if, everybody here was forced to convert to a new religion. There was a lot of like underground Catholic ceremonies going on, right? There are a lot of people who didn't want to be Anglican. They wanted to still be Catholic, and so that's going to influence a lot of the policy that Elizabeth is going to put into place, including things that are going to influence the theater. So, let's see, Mario, can you go ahead and read this slide for us, please?
Rules for Elizabethan stage. No female actors, no biblical figures allowed on stage. Public theaters were affordable, and private theaters were more expensive and exclusive.
Exactly. Okay, so no female actors, right? Which we pretty much talked about in medieval times. What were women allowed to play during medieval theater? Does anybody remember? There were like a couple of roles that we talked about that women could play. They were very specific roles. So if they're religious plays, what are some specific characters that are female that you would want to have women play? Nope, we don't have puppets during this time, Easton. Nope, no animals. Who's a really important role in Christian? Yeah, they're specific people. Okay, here we go. Couple of people are saying it privately. Mary, right? Mary's a big important role, okay? So you want to have Jesus's mother portrayed by a female, right? So that's one of the biggest ones. The other roles were any saints that were female, right? So if they were female characters that were really significant, then they needed to be played by women, right? But now we're back to no females allowed on stage because it's not religious theater anymore, okay? That leads us to the second point. No biblical figures allowed on stage. So based on what I've told you about religion in England now at this time, why do you think that is? It would encourage people to convert to other religions. Well, they're pretty much just restricting people to the Anglican Church, okay? But think about that. Created their own religion. They're not really creating their own religion so much as they are, there was tension about the Catholic Church, right? So they didn't want to risk these characters being portrayed in a way that sort of encouraged a return to Catholicism. They didn't want to encourage people, they wanted to separate entertainment and religion very cleanly now, okay? So that's part of the reason for that rule. Then we have public and private theaters, which we're going to get into in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I want you to go ahead and fill out this poll. Do you agree with this decision to ban biblical figures from the stage? Do you think it was a smart idea? We've got a bunch of no's. We've got a bunch of no's. So those of you who are saying no, I want to hear why you're saying no. Valeria, I don't see you in the Nearpod. Can you join the Nearpod, please? We've got a couple of people saying yes now. Those of you who are missing the Nearpod, here it is again. I know Giselle's having Wi-Fi trouble. Okay, I've heard from almost all of you. So those of you who are saying no, tell me why. If you don't agree with it. Mario says, I put yes because if I was there and trying to restrict one religion and didn't know any better, I would think that's a great way. Okay, right. Those of you who said no, tell me why you said no. Let's see, who voted no? Vincent, you voted no. Tell me why you said no.
No, I voted no. I meant yes.
Okay. All right. So if you agree, why do you think she did that?
Well, I think it was to like stop the people from still associating with the old church instead
Yeah.
of the new one.
Yeah, good. Navi, you voted no. Tell me why. Or let's see, we also have a no from. Oh, some people are changing their votes. We got people changing them to yeses. Yeah, what we're getting at is her. No, she should have let people stay with the church if they want to. Her motivation was definitely to keep the country united, right? There's no freedom of religion at this point in England. It's about she's the first woman to sort of inherit the throne in a very long time. She inherits it under sort of some problematic circumstances. Her father wasn't the greatest, right? And so she's trying to really sort of keep any controversy to a minimum, right? That's really her motivation. Okay, good. So the first public theater. Let's see. Oh, that's okay, Zion. Just remember, you guys, if your Wi-Fi drops, you have to come back. You don't have to apologize. I know it's nothing any of us can control. That's for sure. Ray, why don't you read this slide for us? I don't know if she can hear me. Ray, there? Can you hear me? Okay, how about Bennett? Can you read this slide for us?
James Burbage built theater in 1576. The Lumberford Theater was used to build the Globe after Elizabeth I was banned from theaters from the city limits of London.
Okay, yes. All right, so the very first public theater is just called theater with a capital T. And it's built in 1576 by James Burbage. Okay. So pretty easy to remember, right? No tricks here. And he builds basically I'm going to show you a map of this. He builds basically the theater on the very edge of the city of London. So let me share the screen with you. Okay. All right. So this image shows you where all the theaters end up. So the Thames actually sort of, you see how there's this like thing here? This is the city wall and the Tower of London. So this was what the city of London really was. And then the Thames was the border here. So they had theater sort of in this spot. Can you see my pointer? Can I put a dot on it? Yeah, I can. Okay, so they had theater sort of right like here. I don't know if that makes it actually any easier to see. Let's see if I make it red. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this is where theater was. Okay. Then what happens is that this area becomes sort of a bad part of town. It's not great. It's kind of a nasty place to be. And a lot of the people who are sort of an upper society, they blame theater, literally the play or for creating this area, right? There's lots of brothels, there's lots of prostitutes, there's lots of, this is where like all the rundown area of town, okay? So Elizabeth I is sort of pushed into a situation where she's forced to ban public theaters from the city of London, which she does. Their solution to this problem is to literally take the lumber, like take it down piece by piece, take the lumber on a barge and just move it across the river here to build the Globe. Okay, so now it's not in the city of London, right? But it's still very easy to get to because they have they have boats that go across all the time. And then right here you have the London Bridge, right? So you can see here in the county of Surrey, which is not in the city of London, this is going to be where all the public theaters are. And then places like Blackfriars, Whitefriars, the Warwick Inn. See how Lincoln's Inn? It's it's just outside, right? Those are going to be, these are private theaters that are still allowed inside. But all the public theaters are on this side of the Thames, so that they're kosher, they're allowed, right? Pretty smart. Let me stop sharing. All right, so let's go back to the Nearpod, okay? So the Globe, right? This is pretty much the theater that the public theater that most people know of. We know that it held over 3,000 people. Oh, here, I'm going to give you guys the link to that picture in case you want it. We know that it was very cheap to see a play. Now, obviously, some of the seats were better than others, and I'm going to show you a picture of sort of what the inside looks like. But theoretically, even the people who had the least amount of money could pay to go see a play in Shakespeare's theater. It was about a penny. Okay. And it wasn't a good seat, but you could get in. It was often closed during the plague. Like you can imagine right now, the last thing that you want during a plague is 3,000 people crammed into a theater, right? And its thatched roof caused it to burn down in 1613. So let me show you, this is the reconstruction of the Globe and what it looks like today. Now, this is not a perfect reconstruction. However, it is what the Royal Shakespeare Company acts out of. So you can see all these people down here that are packed together. They're standing. Those were the cheap seats. And the people down there, and I'm going to put it in the chat, are called groundlings. All right. So the cheapest seats, you would stand to watch the play, and you were sort of packed in that area, right? Right up against the stage. And these people would heckle the players. Sometimes they would throw stuff. I mean, it was a very rowdy situation. Okay. Then if you had a little bit more money, but you were still sort of lower class, you could pay to sit on benches in sort of this first little area here. If you had more money, you were probably a part of the merchant class. You could sit up above. You would be sort of above the unwashed masses down below, right? And then the very expensive seats. The place where the lords and the ladies, princes, and everything would sit would be up in the third area. You can tell there's no roof, right, over the majority of the audience members. Everyone who's a groundling it's open to the air. We have let me get a slightly different picture here so that you can see it from another angle. Yeah, here we go. So you can see the thatched roof, but you can see how it's open to the air, right? Thatched roof. Here's where the actors would make their entrances and exits from and where things would be stored. So it burns to the ground. How does it burn to the ground? Well, they were doing some special effects and they were lighting off a cannon to make like war sounds. And I think it was a production of Henry V or Richard III. I can't remember. It catches the roof on fire and the whole thing, because it's all made of wood, right? Just burns right to the ground. Wah, wah, right? Fire, of course, was like a pretty big danger when you were living here. I'll put this picture in there too. When you were living, in London, because if one building caught fire, it could easily spread, right? All right, good. Let's go back to the Nearpod. All right, the globe continued. And if you look at those pictures, you can see these things. Minimal scenery, right? They don't have a lot of room. Not a lot of room for scenery. If you click the bottom one that we were just looking at, you can see not a lot on there, right? But they did use things like curtains and tapestries to try to make it look really nice, or at least give you the idea of where we were. So if a play took place mostly indoors, they would try to reflect that. If it took place mostly outside, they would try to reflect that too. They did use special effects. Remember how we talked about all those special effects from medieval theater? A lot of those stay, like smoke, thunder runs, which was basically like, think of like a seesaw, but it was made of something that was kind of like a bowling alley. And they would put a cannonball in that and rock it back and forth so it would make sort of like thunder sounds. Trapdoors were very common. One of the things that they would do for scenery was that somebody would bring out like maybe like a little tree in like a pot and put it on stage. And then they would tell us that we're in a forest, right? And the tree serves as a reminder so that we're like, okay, yeah, we're in a forest. And then we just fill in the rest with our imagination. Okay, types of theaters. Zion, why don't you go ahead and read this one for us?
Public. Open in the summer, able to sit thousands. The Globe, and it was affordable. Private theater, it was open in the winter. You can only sit a few hundred people. And Black Affairs, and it was expensive and exclusive.
Yes, exactly. So why would they need a different kind of theater for the winter? Remember, we're in London. Yeah, it's cold and the roof is open, right? So we can't have theater outside when it's nasty out, right? So look at the picture here of Blackfriars. Hopefully you guys can see this. What does this look like to you? A private theater. Yep, it is a private theater. That's correct. Think of the name. Does anybody know what a friar is? It looks hot. Yeah, it would definitely be more comfortable during the winter, that's for sure, right? Look up the word fryer. Yeah, exactly. Friar. A church. Yes, Torin. So, what some of these private theaters were churches, right? Because think about a church. It already has sort of like a place for a ceremony to take place. It already has designated areas for people to sit, right? So they were these Catholic monasteries that ended up basically getting converted into theaters, right? Because they're not being used for Catholic services anymore, right? So they convert them into these small private theaters. It looks a lot different than the Globe, right? So much smaller, much more expensive, much more exclusive, and really was only used during the winter time when you definitely didn't want to go outside and sit or stand for hours, in the winter to watch a play. Okay. Good. All right. Back to the Nearpod. So it's a collaborative board. Oh, we already talked about this. So don't worry, you don't have to answer this one. But we already talked about why were private theaters necessary? Because of the weather, right? That was a big one. Okay, so let's talk about Shakespeare. How many of you have read a Shakespeare play before? And if you have, what have you read? Or watched, maybe, if you watched it in like an English class. Heard of Romeo and Juliet? Okay. Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, that's usually sort of the introductory one for most people. Midsummer Night's Dream. Okay, good, Zion. Julius Caesar. Excellent, Torin. There used to be this incredible version of Midsummer's that I like to show, but they took it off. They don't show it online anymore. You've read Hamlet? Awesome. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about who Shakespeare was and why, he's such an important figure to the theatrical canon today. Vincent, why don't you read the slide for us, please?
Born in the merchant class in Stratford upon Avon, educated but left early to apprentice as a butcher, Anne Hathaway, quick success upon arrival in London.
Okay, so we know that he was born in the merchant class because he went to school. And it's still expensive to go to school. You're going to school, you're being taught by members of the Anglican Church now. But he did enroll in school, but he had to leave. His family sort of started to have some problems with money, and so he apprenticed as a butcher. He ended up marrying a woman named Anne Hathaway. And this was pretty scandalous because Anne Hathaway was not only 8 years older than he was, but she was also a farmer's daughter. So she was much below him in sort of social status, right? So here he is as a merchant class. She's way down here. So what do you guys think might have happened? Why do you think they had to get married? Just if you had to guess. Yep, Zion got it in one. Doot, doot, doot. That's exactly it, right? And they have 3 children. They have their first daughter, then they have some twins. And then there's various theories about why Shakespeare had to leave Stratford, but he eventually goes to London and he finds success pretty quickly after he gets to London. However, we know that he and Anne Hathaway do not end up having the best relationship. If you read any of his sonnets, they are often about 2 people. One of them is a woman he calls his dark lady, who was probably a Black woman. The other one is about a young man. So he did not keep faithful to Anne Hathaway. And we also know that they didn't get along very well because in his will, he leaves her his quote, second best bed. And it was like customary at the time in your will to leave your marriage bed to your wife or husband. So even at the end, he sort of like got to dig in at her. But yeah, he gets to London, and about 3 years later, he's already successful, which is pretty impressive. And I'm going to sort of show you some why I think that happened. Of course, I don't know, but why I think that. The first thing is that he wrote this genre of plays called historical plays. So these were plays that were about the history of London. The very first one that he did was Richard III. But they were also written to promote the family of Elizabeth I, right? So he's writing about England's history, which people are interested in, but he's also writing about like why Elizabeth I is like her family is so great, and that's part of the reason why she's such a great leader. So this obviously gets people really excited about this whole genre of plays that he makes up for England. He also, of course, is writing tragedies and comedies. He writes in a very common poetic meter at the time called iambic pentameter. And he is a businessman and a playwright. Here's why I say this. He wrote a play called Henry IV and Henry V. Henry IV and Henry V. There was a character in those plays called Falstaff who, spoiler alert, dies in Henry V, right? Well, Elizabeth loved Falstaff, the character, so much that she asked Shakespeare to write a play just for him. And so he basically retcons the end of Henry V and writes a play about Falstaff's like happily ever after called The Merry Wives of Windsor. So he pretty much writes like fan fiction for Elizabeth, right? Because she loves this character so much. Then when James comes to power, I think I can switch to the next slide. No. When James comes to power, he comes to power under very sort of like not great circumstances because Elizabeth didn't have an heir. She never had any children. She never got married. James is her cousin. He's from Scotland. And there's a plague going on in London when he becomes king. So he doesn't want to come to London right away, right? He doesn't want to get the plague. So he kind of goes to like one of the country palaces. He's like, I'm going to chill here. I'll be the king long distance. Well, Shakespeare packs up his whole troupe. They're like, we want to get out of London anyway because there's a plague. They go to James, and Shakespeare writes Macbeth specifically for James. It's the only one of his plays that takes place in Scotland, where James was from. And the whole thing is about like witchcraft and the occult, which James was super into, right? So he writes this specifically for James to appeal to him. Isn't that haunted? Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, there's superstition about Macbeth that if you say it in a theater or you're doing it, that lots of like tragedies have occurred at theaters that are doing Macbeth. But yeah, he's very smart. He he's a businessman and he's a playwright. And that's how he sort of keeps in with the royalty for as long as he does. So I want to show you this video, and of course it's not going to work because Nearpod is mad at me today. I must have done something wrong, but it worked the other day when we played it. I wonder why it's not working now. Let me find it. And this is going to be a video about what they call OP, all right? And OP is called original pronunciation. Well, let me share this with you. Oops.
Which opened in 1994, very near to its former site, specializes in original productions of Shakespeare. But it wasn't until 2004 that a play was performed in the original pronunciation, known as OP.
Well, the Globe is known for its original practices. This is why it is here, to try and recreate the theatre as it was in 1600 and thereabouts. And when they started it off, they decided to do original costume, original music with original instruments, original movement around the stage and so on. But they never did original pronunciation because they thought, quite wrongly, but understandably, they thought nobody would understand it. But it was a very, very successful occasion. The seats were packed for that weekend. Everybody loved it. And it was such a success that the Globe then decided to do a second production the following year, production of Troilus and Cressida.
It transports you back through the centuries. It's a very magical, almost hair-raising experience, especially in this space, to hear that accent, a space that's sort of as close as we can get to a 400-year-old theatre. And then an accent that's as close as we can get to a 400-year-old accent with a 400-year-old play. If anything, it rounds the experience of going to see a Shakespeare play out.
David and Ben have also discovered that nearly 2/3 of Shakespeare's sonnets have rhymes that don't work in modern English, but do work in OP.
Give it a good one. What, 116?
I think, 116 is interesting because lots of people have it at their weddings and they think of it as being a very sort of highfalutin sonnet. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments, but it completely changes in OP, particularly because of the rhymes. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and wakes, but bears it out e'en to the edge of dumb. If this be error and upon me proved, I never read, no man ever loved.
Yeah. Proved and loved. I mean, it's a lovely ending, isn't it? Proved and loved, it simply doesn't work.
Completely falters it. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. There's something about working our way back to Shakespeare rather than dragging him into the 21st century. If you can sort of imagine that there's that extra dimension when you're working in a space like this, you get a similar sort of extra dimension when you use Shakespeare's accent.
Okay, so yeah, what you can hear there,
Writing's
right,
not
is that,
that easy,
sorry,
but it's great.
the idea that there's all these rhymes that don't work in modern English, right? But they do when you use the original pronunciation of Shakespeare. And so they're sort of working on incorporating that more. So here's another Collaborate board. Just your thoughts about that idea or how, English sounded 400 years ago. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to write on our Collaborate board here, please. how everyone spoke proper. If you actually read a lot of Shakespeare, there's a lot of like really bawdy, nasty stuff in there. It's just that we don't really catch all of it, partially because of that fact that like it doesn't like make the same, it doesn't sound the same, right? In modern English, but also just like not knowing all the slang. It sounds how pirates sound like. Yeah, I think a lot of the accents that we use for like pirates and stuff sort of sounds like that. So yeah, of course, yeah, at the time it sounded normal. But of course now it doesn't, right? It's probably too complex for me to understand. It's really not if you work at it. It's not easy to do by any stretch of the imagination. What I normally tell people is to get really familiar with a play and then try listening to it in the OP and see if that helps, or even listening to it or while you're reading the script, right? Some words similar but rephrased or written differently, causing it to sound different. Yep. It's complicated but cool. Yeah. So one of the things that my dissertation was about was actually taking Shakespeare and rewriting it in modern English, right? So that people could go from modern English to the text that we have of Shakespeare, and then maybe eventually getting to listening and enjoying it in the OP. I think we have some really good thoughts here. We've got a lot of people who haven't contributed, but we've got, you know, we're all sort of talking about how it's complex. It's difficult for us to understand now. But if you really know a play well, there's some stuff in there that you can understand better when you listen to it in the original pronunciation. I don't know if that makes sense. Does that make sense to you guys? It's like they were saying about the sonnet, you know, like the rhymes don't really work in original English, or in modern English, but if you do it in the OP, then you can hear how they spoke. It's also really cool to think about how we can use that text to go back and figure out what people sounded like 600 or like 400 years ago, you know? Okay, it's kind of like a time machine. All right. So yes, as I mentioned, this is just setting us up for next time. So James I, right, our Scottish king, is succeeded by Charles I. And remember how I said there was like a lot of tension between the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church? Well, that is going to come to a head in the English Civil War, where Oliver Cromwell is going to lead Catholics and a group of people who are called, and I'm putting this in the chat, the Roundheads. They're going to create an army to defeat Charles I, and they behead him in 1649, right? So he's gone. Oliver Cromwell is now in charge. And what happens then is that Charles's son, and basically anybody who could afford to do it, so a lot of like the high society people, they get out of Dodge. They leave the country. They go to France. They call up Louis XIV, and they're like, hey, we're in trouble. And Louis XIV, who is just like having basically a massive party every day, is like, come on over. Like, let's have a 14-year slumber party. And that's basically what they're going to do. They're going to go to France. They're going to spend like 14 years there while Charles II amasses an army and gets support from other European nations and goes back to take the throne, right? So when we meet next time, we're going to cover two different things, but they're like linked. The royal era, which is the time in France under Louis XIV when Charles II is there, and then how that affects the Restoration, which is the period of time when Charles II is restored to the throne. Okay. So the last thing I want you guys to do for me, I don't have an exit ticket for you today, but I do have a tiny homework assignment in Schoology for our class. I want you to go to class content. This is for your homework, and read the information here about the European Theater Project. Write down any questions that you have about that project and bring them with you to the next class. Okay? That project is going to be due in just a little under 2 weeks. Let me see. It's going to be due on the 5th of November, okay? So I want you to read that project statement, write down any questions that you have about it, and bring them with you to the next class, and we will go through those at the beginning of class before we start talking about Restoration and Royal Theater, okay? That's your homework. Any questions before we get out of here? We just have a couple more minutes left, right? Sometimes I forget what time we're going to. Yeah, we have 2 minutes. Any questions? The homework is to read in Schoology. You should see it right here. This European Theater Project. I want you to read that, write down any questions you have, and bring them with you to the next class. Okay? All right, that is it. So I will see you guys on Wednesday. I'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye.